Welcome, everyone. Um, my name is Jonathan Becker. I'm the Vice President for Academic Affairs at Bard College and a Vice Chancellor for the Open Society University Network. And we're very fortunate to have gathered here some experts for what will be a really interesting talk on the current situation in Belarus and Kyrgyzstan, where two of our partner institutions, European Humanities University, was founded, and American University of Central Asia was founded and still exists. EHU is now situated in Vilnius, Lithuania, as many of us know. What I'm going to first do is introduce our panelists and then ask a few questions of them. Then we will open things up for questions from the audience, which you could do in the Q&A section of the Zoom. So let me begin by introducing our panelists. And again, thank you all for coming today. I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion. Our first panelist is Dr. Viktor Martinovich, who from European Humanities University in Belarus. Dr. Martinovich defended his PhD in the field of history of arts at the Vilnius Academy of Fine Arts, and he's currently an associate professor at EHU in Vilnius. He's actually been involved in a number of OSUN and BARD network associated activities and is currently teaching a course on alternate worlds. He's considered one of the most renowned contemporary authors in Belarus and is the author of 8 books, including one which was just released called Revolution, which maybe he'll tell us about before we're done. And I do want to say that Dr. Martinovich has another, because of the time change, there was some conflicts, and he'll be here for the first half hour. So we will be favoring Belarus early on. Our second speaker is Maximas Milta, who heads the Communication and Development Unit at European Humanities University, and he's a part-time faculty member in the Department of Humanities and Arts. Since the start of the revolt in Belarus, Maximus has been a frequent commentator on Lithuanian regional and international media, including BBC, Times Higher Education, and so forth, providing regular reports on the protests and analyses of political movements within the country. Maximus is also an associate analyst of the Eastern Europe Studies Center. Our third panelist is from Kyrgyzstan, and that's Sanya Toktagazayeva. I'd be better off with the Russian rather than the transliteration. She's an associate professor of law at AUCA. Sanya has got her SJD and her LLM in human rights at the Central European University in Budapest, and we're very thrilled to have a CEU graduate with us today. She got her BA in International Business Law at AUCA. And not only is a scholar on constitutional and other issues, but she did win an award for the best teacher at AUCA in her department in 2018, which for us is a particularly wonderful distinction. So again, for those of you still joining, we're going to begin by going around and asking a few preliminary questions. And then we will open it up for questions which you can post in the Q&A section on Zoom at the bottom of your panel. So the first question will go to Victor, who will be with us for the next about 25 minutes. And Victor, I wanted to begin by asking about the origins of the current revolt within Belarus. Could you speak to that for a few minutes, please?
Thank you. The biggest problem, the biggest reason was that they falsified the elections. And the problem is that all previous elections were also falsified. So something changed, and to pick up some general things that changed, I would tell that now in 2020, we have one huge media channel called Telegram, and one of the Telegram broadcasters, they have 2.2 million subscribers in the country where we have only 6 million voters. So this is a huge tool of broadcasting a different views. This was one of the things that changed. emerge of independent, truly independent medias. The guys who make this Telegram channel, they sit outside Belarus, and still they're very involved, and they managed to play their role in changing the moods. Another thing that changed is that 6 years is enormously long term, and everybody is fed up, and this time nobody wanted to keep it inside. So it was even in this spring, like 4 5 months before the revolution itself, there was something in the air that allowed to suppose that something gonna change. So just 26 years is too long for one politician to stay in power and to keep the system sustainable and stable. So this I think the main reasons. Of course, something changed also in terms of new generation which emerged, which appeared, and which was very young 10 years ago during the previous protests. So, but I think the main change is in appearance of big media channel.
Great. Thank you very much, Victor. Maximus, can you perhaps comment on what's going on in Belarus today?
This is day 80 today in Belarus, and the revolt has been lasting for almost 3 months. And I think this is very important that we have this discussion, because what we see often is the fatigue that emerges when the developments of this kind, they are lasting for quite a while. So thank you, Jonathan, for making this discussion happen, and thank you for having us here today. And for these 80 days, we have been witnessing the intergenerational manifestation of solidarity within the Belarusian society. The shift that has emerged, it considers not only the demography, but also the geography of Belarus. Never before in the history of Belarus have we witnessed such a unity in the way how the horizontal driven, the grassroots mobilization is happening. As our viewers may know from the international media attention to Belarus, that indeed this has been a completely different modus of mobilization among people, ranging from young hipsters and entrepreneurs of central Minsk, ending up with people working in the factories in distant regions, and people working, and also people with special needs and seniors. All of them, they are united in this revolt against the brutal regime of Lukashenko. At this moment, we have over 15,500 people detained. There are over 100 political prisoners. There are 450 cases of tortures that have been happening, and they were reported to the United Nations Human Rights Council. After all, there are 6 victims of the revolt, and these figures are caused by the brutality of the regime. Yesterday, the national strike has started in Belarus. The leader of the Belarusian Democratic Society, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who was forced into exile, she had to leave Belarus, and she is currently based in Vilnius, Lithuania. She has issued an ultimatum to Lukashenko regime, and in the course of 13 days, the regime had a chance to release political prisoners and to initiate a genuine dialogue and route free and transparent elections. As a result of that, as we see, the regime has not fulfilled the demands of the ultimatum. On the contrary, it continued to do detentions, and what is a very frequent tactics of the regime is the use of riot police officers without insignia, without any uniforms. Basically, you have a thug-alike regime acting on a carte blanche mood in Belarus. So the national strike continues for already 2 days. We see that the largest Belarusian industries have been involved in the strike. The scale of the strike varies across the industry, but also this is important that the private sector is joining the strike. The academia is joining. We have at least 10 public universities where student strikes are taking place. In addition to that, we see that basically there are over 100 enterprises in the private sector that have vocally joined the strike, and the scale of mobilization basically takes into action all social groups of Belarusian society that before were considered as backbones of the regime. It's not only about pensioners, but also about the sportsmen who were a source of Lukashenko's personal pride. We talk also medical staff, and more we see social groups emerging. So basically, the regime at this moment disposes only two social groups: the nomenclature, the top bureaucracy, or apparatchiki, as they were called in the Soviet regime, and also those called in Russian siloviki. So basically, riot police, secret police, units that are estimated at the range of 95,000 people. Despite the fact that the internet connection is shut down on every Sunday, despite the fact that people may be detained without any reason, and there is basically no possibility to use council as assistance, still people continue going out in the streets. On Sunday, there was again the 11th Sunday rally in a row, and 200,000 people in Minsk alone has joined the rally. I think this is more than visible demonstration that there is no fatigue, but the stamina of the protesters is still there, and this is only a matter of time how long Lukashenko regime will last.
Thank you, Maximus. A lot of provocative comments. I want to turn to Sania and ask. Obviously, we have a different circumstance in Kyrgyzstan, and I want to note that she has the weight of justice behind her in her background, which is wonderful. If in Belarus we're looking at a ongoing popular revolt, in Kyrgyzstan we are dealing often now in the weeds of constitutional challenges. And I wonder if you could give us some background as to what is taking place in Kyrgyzstan currently.
Sure. Thank you for having me here today. I just wanted to provide some background mostly and evaluate whatever it is happening now in Kyrgyzstan from legal point of view. So essentially we had yet another civil unrest, which is no longer that, which is becoming very common for Kyrgyzstan. But this time things are completely different than in 2005 and 2010. So what were the main preconditions for this event? Essentially, since the collapse of the Soviet Union up until now, we had this pervasive corruption in our society, and this corruption has been actually deteriorating, especially for the last 5 years, let's say. Now we have this strong clientelism happening, and on top of that, the impact of COVID also led to the harsh economic deterioration in Kyrgyz Republic. And as a result, we had in early October parliamentary elections, which a lot of things revolved around it. Like there was unprecedented facts of massive vote buying, use of administrative resources, the influence of organized crime groups in the election process, which led to the fact that the election results were completely unfair, and only pro-governmental parties actually made it to the parliament, who passed the 7% threshold. And with this unfair results of the elections, the opposition leaders went to the Alato Square, it's the traditional place where we always go, demanding to cancel the results of the elections. This was the main demand of the people who went there. And as a result, we had this civil unrest, and over the night, they took the White House. The next day, the Central Election Commission invalidated the results of the parliamentary elections. And during the night, the former president Atambayev was released together with a number of others. But I guess the most prominent person was Sadir Japarov, who is now the acting president and acting prime minister. He was imprisoned he was the former convict for human kidnapping, essentially. And what we had the next day, we no longer had the official government. They were completely silent. The opposition leaders were not clear which way to choose, because essentially they had two options or scenarios. Like they could do what happened in 2010, essentially applying the rule of exception, getting rid of parliament, president, and everything, establish the interim government, and rule Kyrgyzstan by some weird things like decrees. Or do it according to the rule of law, meaning that in order to get out of this crisis, just do what the constitution says. So over the day, what we have experienced is the complete inaction, both from the part of the official government and plus the opposition leaders. And of course, this was the time when all lawyers started calling for bringing back all the situation to the constitutional landscape, so that this was the best option. Because if we compare this situation with what happened in 2010, this year everything was so different because the opposition leaders were very dispersed. It was not united. If they did they did in 2010, I guess the Kyrgyzstan was at the edge of civil war. So the best solution for them would be actually to do what the constitution actually said. However, what we have experienced during the day is that number of coordination councils started, were created. Some representatives from specific, very like populistic nationalist parties like Mekenchil, Chonkhazat, literally started like self-appointing themselves, right? And we said, okay, this is not the right thing to do. Let's come back to the legal landscape and get out of this crisis using the available legal means and measures that we have in the constitution. So what's interesting is that over the night, the Supreme Court of the Kyrgyz Republic acquitted Sadr Japarov, because Sadr Japarov essentially wanted to become the prime minister, and there is a specific limitation that the person who has the former conviction cannot become the prime minister. But this is how our judicial system actually works. And then the parliament, with the questionable quorum, Sadr Japarov as the prime minister and approved his cabinet of ministers. And it took parliament 3 times to get together with the normal quorum and do everything according to the constitution. And only after the 3rd attempt, they did it and succeeded it. So after basically Sadr Japarov became the prime minister, his followers did not get away from the square. They started demanding that the president, Janbekov, should resign. Essentially, he did it. And what's interesting is that according to the constitution, if president resigns, then the acting president becomes the speaker. But what's interesting is that under the pressure of the supporters of Sadr Japarov, the Speaker of the Parliament also refused to get the position of the acting president. And now what we have is the Sadr Japarov becoming both the Prime Minister and acting president of the Kyrgyz Republic. So from the early days, Sadr Japarov announced that he wants to do the constitutional reform. And in his terms, constitutional reform means that Kyrgyzstan should depart from parliamentary form of government, go back to the presidential form, get rid of political parties, bring back the majoritarian system of election to the parliament. So currently what we see is that there are like 3 different attempts from the side of the Sadr Japarov and his team to get and succeed this constitutional reform. First is through something what we call a People's Assembly, which is like Narodny Kurultai. Second is he's trying to do it through parliament by calling the referendum. And another interesting thing is now currently we have an application or complaint that was brought to Constitutional Chamber with a specific intent to rehabilitate the Constitution of 1993. So later on, what we had is that in October 21st, the Central Election Commission announced the re-election of Parliament and set the date for December 20. Right after they did it, so the huge pressure happened on the members of the Central Election Commission. Criminal charges were brought against them because essentially what the Sadr Japarov and his supporters want and his team is not to let the parliamentary elections happen in December. So what's interesting now is that in October 22, Parliament passed the constitutional law, which clearly suspended the parliamentary election, prolonged their term, which actually already expired officially by the Constitution, and announced the constitutional reform. So this decision or the law is now currently being evaluated by all lawyers in Kyrgyzstan. By all lawyers here, I mean like reasonable lawyers in Kyrgyzstan, as unconstitutional, because the way how this law has been passed was full of violation, both from like substantively and procedurally, because they passed this law in 3 readings simultaneously without any public discussion and whatsoever. And substance wise, it is as well. Like there is no mention in the constitution which says that the parliament can on their own will prolong their own duties and suspend the elections. So currently this decision now is being challenged by the number of political parties before the constitutional chamber of the Kyrgyz Republic, and we are waiting for that. Another interesting thing is that Japarov announced that he's going to run for the upcoming presidential elections. However, according to the constitution, there is the clear provision which says that the acting president cannot participate in presidential elections. So as you can see, this entire process is being now followed by fundamental violations of the constitution. And all the lawyers in Kyrgyz Republic are demanding both parties, like especially the Sadr Japarov and his team, to act according to the law and the constitution. Because if we don't do that, right now Kyrgyzstan is experiencing this huge legitimacy crisis, both at the national level and international level. So yeah, this is the brief, basically overview of what is happening in Kyrgyzstan.
Thank you. Thank you. Victor, I want to turn back to Belarus, which is, as we said, in a different situation. And I guess if in Kyrgyzstan, they're talking on the constitutional level, in Belarus, there's a question about what can and are people doing on different levels. So what are, you just wrote this book on revolution, right? What are intellectuals doing? What are professors doing? What are students doing to try to impact the current crisis?
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I think the main problem is that nothing can be done on the level of state institutions, because they are blocked and controlled by these people in black. So instead of situation in Kyrgyzstan, where they have kind of political crisis, we have kind of civil war, and the forces in this civil war are unproportional. We have a big majority. We have majority of people who are peaceful and unarmed, and we have a minority which well armed and very violent, and they have right to put people in prison. So that's why it's a big question, and the importance of other forces, other actors become very important. I mean, become very important. What do other people do? What instead of government officials, instead of code of laws which are blocked, and instead of people who are protesting on the streets. So since I represent the university, since I represent the writers community, I have to say that I think I always asked myself, since I'm a person who evidenced the collapse of USSR, I was always interested, what killed USSR? I cannot believe that it was prices on the oil, which were damaged by this war in Afghanistan, and which provoked a deep economical crisis. I was a pupil at that time, the school pupil, and I remember these times very well. And what I felt, and what I still feeling, is that USSR was killed by rock music. The moment they decided to invite Western rock in the country was the moment when the wall started collapsing. And that's why, of course, you shouldn't listen to me too attentively, because I'm interested actor, I'm a writer myself. But I have a feeling that culture is the main tool of changes. And now with my colleagues from my university, from European Humanities University, we're thinking about making a screenplay about the protests, because I evidenced so many and I heard so many theater stories past 2-3 weeks. One of our students was imprisoned, and after she was released, we met with her, and she told that they were searched every morning at 7 a.m. In the cell, and half an hour before the wake up, the radio started to broadcast the state anthem of Republic of Belarus. And after that, they allowed one of the state-owned radios to broadcast to the camera. And it was very funny, a very theatrical scene when the whole room of girls, 17 girls, in very small cell, are searched by these special black people, and out of a sudden the Beyonce melody starts singing. Beyonce starts singing, and you hear really very popular music, and you see very horrible scene. When I heard it, I thought that it's totally theatrical scene. It should be put in a theater, and the problem is that it can't be put on the scene in Belarus. So it should be somehow converted in international project with probably our colleagues in other countries, in Russia, in Kyrgyzstan, would be interested to do something on violence, on violence on stage, on violence on protests, and so on. So just finishing, ending the thought that I think I should say that the culture, the humanity, the language, and the artistry are the tools for the victory. In the situation where no victory is possible because only one side is armed, and this side is on the not our side. This is it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think it's really exciting that in that context that the Open Society University Network is developing a master's degree in art and human rights, somewhere where you and Sania would probably meet at some point, being developed by Tanya Khoury, Ziad Abou-Rish, and Thomas Keenan, and Gideon Lester. So very, very exciting. Thank you. And I know you're going to bow out soon. Stay with us as long as you can, but we really appreciate it. Maximus, I wanted to, we've heard some about grassroots mobilization and the current circumstance there. And, we were discussing this before because I had Bart's Center for Civic Engagement. Tell us about civic engagement and what's currently going on in Belarus and what that means to you and the students of EHU.
Sure, with pleasure. I think civic engagement and community engagement in a broader sense are essential tools to understand the tactics, the ongoing daily life of Belarusians in the circumstances of the revolt. And this is also a very important way how can we find an answer on the question, how did Belarusians manage to self-organize on such incredible level, on such incredible scale? This is all due to civic engagement. When you were asking the Victor about the triggers of the revolt, I think, given my background in political sciences, I think it's important also to stress the geopolitical factor that has been there. It was in late 2019 that Lukashenko has initiated another wave of the so-called negotiations with the Kremlin in order to approximate Belarus closer to Russia, and by virtue of the so-called roadmaps, and there was a total of 31 roadmaps addressing various issues of closer integration between Belarus and Russia. And as you know, Belarus is totally dependent on Russian energy supplies, and simply saying there is no single sphere of economy of Belarus where Russia wouldn't have a dominant position, except for IT sector, I would say, however. So therefore, the unrest of the people and mobilization that has been witnessed, although predominantly taking place within the independent media and social media, was quite important. And then the COVID has started. And as you know, there are several world leaders currently that have demonstrated quite bizarre attitude to COVID. And one of them is Mr. Lukashenko, who basically has ignored the COVID existence as such. And when the real threat has emerged to people's life and safety, when people of Belarus have realized that the social contract, the so-called social contract that has been basically the backbone of the Belarusian regime, and by social contract I mean the relatively poor, however stable, salary income that the regime guarantees to its citizens. And as you know, in Belarus, the share of the government in the broader economy still remains quite significant. It's roughly 62% of the economies that are occupied by the state-controlled enterprises. So the social contract has demonstrated its has become obsolete. And people needed to get together, people needed to self-organize in order to find not only the medical equipment and protection gear, but also to provide support to the medical staff that also lacked medical supplies. And the experience, the successful and positive experience of self-organization has become tremendously important in empowering Belarusians. They have seen by virtue of crowdfunding, by virtue of crowdsourcing, they're able to not only change their lives by protecting the life and safety, but also to achieve a synergy in their cooperation. In the course of last 15 years, the so-called creative class of Belarus has emerged thanks to the rapid development of information technology sector. It occupies around 6% of Belarusian GDP. And as you know, some of the really remarkable applications and software are currently developed in Belarus. In Minsk alone, there are around 100,000 people who are economically dependent on the IT sector. And these achievements of crowdfunding, crowdsourcing, fighting COVID, and therefore getting united against the state-driven propaganda about non-existence of COVID, they were predominantly driven by the new creative class of Belarus, and specifically supported by IT activists who have turned themselves also into NGO/civic activism. And therefore, people have seen that this is no more the so-called traditional opposition that is a uniting factor, but rather the common sense of duty, the duty of being what a good citizen it is, or the duty of taking care of your neighbor, of your community, making your share in order to ensure more or less sustainable environment in your neighborhood. These were the key motivators. Now, when the presidential campaign has started in late May, the detentions have also emerged across all cities of Belarus. And before the date of presidential elections as such, and it has taken place on August 9th, there were already 1,300 people who were detained, including major opposition candidates, or let's say major candidates for presidential position. And this is where the role of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the spouse of renowned vlogger Sergei Tikhanovsky, has been remarkable, because she herself has demonstrated by personal experience that people are able to transform themselves, to take responsibility for themselves, for their community, for their people. And from being back in May, as they say in Belarus, a housewife, although it's a debatable term, let's say here, I believe, but nevertheless, she has turned in a politician that is not only trusted and recognized by Belarusian people, but who is also meeting the world leaders like Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, and the rest. So therefore, it is a demonstration of a personal strength, a personal bravery. And I believe many of our viewers today have seen the stories of this female triumvirate, 3 leading female activists behind the revolt in Belarus. In each of them, Veronika Tsepkala, Maria Kolesnikova, and Svetlana Tikhanovskaya has contributed their share. It has been a quite remarkable story where one of them, Maria Kolesnikova, needed to tear up her passport on the border when she was exiled into Ukraine, and by that action, she has basically blocked the possibility for her to be exiled abroad, and now she is currently imprisoned. I want also to stress the fact that it is also about the local mobilization taking place not only in Minsk, but all around the country. Thanks to the application that Victor has already mentioned, Telegram Messenger, which is relatively popular in countries where internet connection is blocked, and Belarus is no inclusion in that, there is a possibility to create groups that are geographically attached, GPS attached to particular neighborhoods. And in Minsk alone, we have over 800 such groups. Some of them are smaller, others are larger, ranging up to 1,000 members. And through these groups, this is where the grassroots mobilization happens. So these are people-to-people contacts where people go out in the streets together, they take care of their hood, and they see that only by virtue of being united, horizontally mobilized, they're able to reach this synergy by taking care of their neighbors, by taking care of their living. And I believe this is what civic engagement par excellence looks like when we talk not only in the academic categories, but in real life scenario as it is in Belarus. And lastly, I want to stress the fact, which is, I believe, very important. There is no single community in Belarus that would not be personally touched by the unprecedented scale of aggression from the regime. When it comes to EHU, we had 6 students who were detained. We have 25 graduates of EHU who were detained. And currently we have 2 students of EHU who are political prisoners, who remain in prison. These are our 2 students of international law and European Union law programs. They are recognized by international human rights organizations and political prisoners. And these are very clear examples, these personal stories, that no one is protected from being detained, but at the same time, this is a personal courage. This is a personal decision that people take that brings us closer to the tipping point. And this is only the question of time.
Thank you, Maximus. I want to tell people that if you want to pose the panelists a question, please use the Q&A. I'm going to ask Sania one more question, and then we'll open it up to those. It's a 2-part question, actually. First of all, one of the challenges within Kyrgyzstan is that you have a 7% threshold, and yet the parliamentary parties, I know this because I follow various parties which people from AUCA support on Facebook, were greatly divided, right? And so therefore, even had elections been free and fair, it's unclear how many would have exceeded the 7% threshold. So my question is there a constitutional conversation about changing the threshold, or is there a conversation within the parties themselves about cooperating to clear the threshold if there are free and fair elections in the future? And then more broadly, what do you see the way out of this crisis? So thank you.
So this is a very interesting question, because what happened is that after the civil unrest, certain political parties, particularly Birbol and Atamiken, they started actively lobbying the law in parliament on reducing the threshold to 3%. And they actually, what's interesting is that the same day, on October 22nd, the parliament passed the law, which actually lowered down the threshold to the 3%. And then 15 minutes later, they have passed the constitutional law, which suspended parliamentary elections. So, which was really like weird, which means like, if they're going to do the constitutional reform, this 3% threshold law, like we can just put it into the trash, because the reform will bring back the presidential form with no political parties, only like the single district candidates and etc. So what we see is that, like, from the beginning, most like constitutional lawyers, we were actually advising political party leaders that they should not now be so kind of obsessed about this threshold, because what is coming is actually the constitutional reform. Because if they would be putting all their energy to lowering this threshold, completely forgetting about the constitutional reform, there is a chances that they would basically be left out without any elections. And this is what is happening now, right? This law literally suspended, and we still don't know when the elections will be, because Sadr Japarov one day comes and says it's going to be in October, then he says it's going to be in June, you know, like every day he changes his mind. And that's why now one of the ways of getting out of this crisis is to have the parliamentary elections in in December 20, as it has been said by Central Election Commission, because this is what the Constitution says. If the elections are found invalid, then they must be basically, the next elections must be scheduled again. And I think tomorrow there's going to be the forum of political parties, because what's interesting is that around 30 political parties have already expressed their desire to participate in the next elections, but then these elections have been suspended But the lawyers are saying that the only correct decision that has been made is by Central Election Commission. This is the only way to get out of this crisis, because as look at what Russia is saying, or the other international organizations or foreign states, they're literally not willing to recognize the regime of Sadr Japarov. So which means we are experiencing the crisis of legitimacy. And the only way of getting out of it is essentially to have a legitimate parliament that must be elected in December 20. And then only they can start talking about constitutional reform and etc. So this is the only way. But then some politicians are blaming lawyers that we are being too formalistic, that we don't understand the political context, you know. But I think that who is really playing the games here are the politicians. They're literally playing with our future. Like, why can't they just have another elections? Their justification is like, there is a deficit in the budget, we don't have money. But then do we have money for conducting a constitutional referendum? Like, it will require the same amount of money. So which means it's not really a justification. So today, European Union have officially announced that they're not going to give this financial support in the amount of 6 million euros until they will basically conduct the elections, which is a good sign, because this is what the lawyers have been calling for, international community, that they should do something, at least with from financial or monetary advice and etc. So this is, in my opinion, the only way to get out of this crisis is just to follow what the Constitution says. And Constitution says that we need to have parliamentary elections in December 20 by political parties, by proportionate system. And no, we should not give away for the constitutional reform, which would bring back the presidential form, because we all know that in the context of former Soviet Union, any presidential forms would lead into super presidential form of governance. Yeah.
Right. Well, you have a super presidential form of governance in Belarus, Maximas. What do you see the way out? You've hinted at this, but I wonder if you could concretely talk about that. And again, there's one question up there, and I'll cycle back to that. And then I'm encouraging other folk watching to post questions in the Q&A.
Different from the elections of 2001, 2006, 2010, or 2015, when the international community was also making statements on fraud and falsifications. This time we see that there were more tangible steps taken. First, we see that the Western world does not recognize Lukashenko as legitimate ruler of Belarus. And it's not only about the media labeling, and for instance, here in Lithuania and elsewhere, Lukashenko is no more presented on media as president of Belarus. He is presented as a legitimate ruler of Belarus, but also it's about diplomatic contacts. We see that no more the civilized world recognizes Lukashenko regime, but at the same time, there is a certain flux that the situation has appeared at, due to a following reason. Belarus is the only country in Europe which is not a member of the Council of Europe. So basically, we have only two international organizations that both Belarus and Russia and the Western world are members of. These are the United Nations and the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Now, within the OSCE, as a rule, we know that OSCE is the institution that provides international observers for elections. This time, Lukashenko has not allowed any international observers to be present in the country, but there is this mechanism called the Moscow procedure at OSCE, when a certain amount of OSCE member states can initiate an investigation against one of the OSCE member states. Belarus is the only country against which a Moscow procedure has been initiated for the second time. In the course of the history of OSCE, there were only 6 instances when this mechanism was used. So we see that the incoming Swedish chairmanship of the OSCE will be the one that will be basically continuing to deal with the case of Belarus, because there is only one scenario possible: the peaceful transfer of power in order to arrange free and transparent elections. This is the question of time, because there is a number of variables. And one of the most important variable is the role of Kremlin in the ongoing revolt and in the relations with Belarus, because the Kremlin has too many assets in Belarus just to let Belarus go from its orbit. And it's not only the security dimension, but this is also the economy dimension. At the same time, for Kremlin, this is evident that Belarus is not Crimea. This is impossible to occupy Belarus in the manner that Russia has occupied Crimea and started war in eastern Ukraine. And therefore, 9.5 million people living in Belarus is 6 times more the population that lives in Crimea. Belarus is also a relatively large country. Its area is comparable to the area of Great Britain. It's over 200,000 square kilometers, by the way. So we talk about relatively large country. It's not just a minor one. And therefore, a more hybrid ways how Russia would ensure its interest present during the transition period are the ones now highly debated in circles of political scientists. It is expected that the most realistic transition maneuver would be the so-called constitutional reform. But now for Lukashenko, constitutional reform is the way how to to prolong its presence in the office. Because what Lukashenko is trying to call the constitutional reform, in fact, is not such. It is a super presidential republic that is currently in Belarus, and it's been introduced by the constitution that was amended by Lukashenko with significant fraud during the 1995 referendum. The constitution of 1994 has been a constitution for a parliamentary republic, and therefore one of the ideas and of the proposals of the democratic society of Belarus is to return back to 1994 constitution. So it's important to highlight the role of IT and technological tools in these whole debates, because effectively in Belarus, no one can be sure what was the real turnout on the day of presidential elections. What were the real results of the presidential elections? Because one cannot trust the results of the Central Election Committee. At the same time, thanks to IT community, there was another platform created called Golos, or the Voice, translated from Russian. This is a crowdsourcing-driven platform where 1.2 million users from Belarus are registered, and all of them are verified users over the age of 18, who basically have uploaded their ballots, indicated the constituency, indicated who they were voting for. And this was the first instance when Belarusians demonstrated their ability to create separate parallel institutions to those that are occupied and serving the Lukashenko regime. And this platform now is very actively used in order to basically to test the waters when it comes to Belarusian society mood. It's not only about the legitimacy of the Coordination Council that was established at the mandate of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and basically the 70-member is a council of 70 members that represent various groups of Belarusian society, but also it's about the testing Belarusians' opinion about the Lukashenko's approach to try to implement the constitutional reform. Every now and then we see that it's close to 500,000 Belarusians who demonstrate in this Golos platform their position that they are eager to carry on with the revolt in order to reach its intended goals. So what can we do in this instance is to support Belarusians who are suffering from aggression of the regime. The best way to do that is by using the crowdfunding platforms. There are 2 crowdfunding platforms called Buy Soul and Buy Help. Both of them have collected more than $7 million that are provided for the support of those detained, injured, those who are dismissed from their jobs because of political reasons. And the newest form of support that Belarusian diaspora across the globe has started is You Strike, We Work rally. And the idea is that Belarusians across the globe, they are working in order to provide money transfer to these crowdfunding platforms that in their instance are supporting the Belarusians on strikes. Yet alone, there was $500,000 collected just during 24 hours to support that cause. So we see that Belarusians are quite united in their strike for freedom. And this is once again not the geopolitical demand that you can hear in the streets. People are not going out with flags of EU or with the flags of Russia. No, they go out with Belarus national flags because what they want to get rid of is this bloody personalistic regime that can be comparable in historical terms to the regime of Nicolae Ceausescu of Romania. The difference is, however, that Belarusians during all these 80 days of the revolt, they demonstrate incredibly peaceful character. There was no single window broken, no single car blown, and this is quite also unprecedented. What can be, I guess, compared to the movement of solidarity in Poland of 80s, or to the movement of Sąjūdis here in Lithuania of late 80s as well.
Thank you very much. It's interesting facing, there's a little thing called an election coming up in the US 1 week from today. So the idea, and a lot of concerns about ballot security. So we may be behind on that, but that's a really interesting thought in terms of recording your vote. Sonia, there's a question from Dasha Pushkina from Russia, who wanted to pose the question about the United States and the US role in Kyrgyzstan, if there is any. So perhaps you could speak to that very briefly.
Mm-hmm. So briefly, so far, like right after these events, I think on October 13, the United States Embassy in Kyrgyz Republic made a very good statement, which essentially they have raised their concern that there's currently happening as one of the main obstacles towards the democratic process is the attempt by organized crime groups to exert the influence over politics and elections. And they have called for the peaceful and democratic transition in Kyrgyzstan, and essentially to listen, which was very interesting, to listen to legal scholars in Kyrgyz Republic to return to the political life of the country to a constitutional order. This was the official statement that has been made by the US Embassy in the Kyrgyz Republic. The second statement that they made, it was last week. So the last week, what we have is that one of the well-known criminal, Khamchik Ulbayev, have been caught, and for over a number of years, he has been actually searched by the United States Department of State, and they have uploaded this fact as well. So officially, these were the so far two main statements that has been made by the United States with respect to the situation. So generally what they're calling is that encouraging the government strictly follow the rules and what the Constitution says in order to bring back the constitutional order and make sure that it will not be influenced by the organized crime groups. So this the states have raised their concerns about Kyrgyzstan.
Thank you. Maximus, you touched on it in your last answer, but maybe you can delve in a little deeper. We have a question from Joe Glicksberg from the Open Society Foundation, who's asking about Russia and Lukashenko, which has been a very complicated relationship, as we know. Sometime the Putin and Lukashenko as well. Who is the dog and who is the tail, as it were? And so, what is the current view of Russia vis-a-vis Lukashenko, and the extent to which it will, what outcomes Russia may tolerate given the geopolitics in Belarus?
Well, indeed, we need to have a separate discussion on Lukashenko-Kremlin relations because it's a very deep topic. But to put it in a nutshell, first point, Lukashenko regime would not be existing if not supported by Russia. Second, on an institutional side of things, Belarus and Russia are enormously closely integrated. De facto, Belarus is integrated into all security structures of Russia, and also economy-wise, we see that 80% of Belarusian debt belongs to Russia. And therefore, the unsustainability of the Belarusian economy is also manifested through a 100% energy dependence of Belarus to Russia, especially when it comes to gas supplies. So therefore, the room for maneuver for Belarus, whoever the new president is, whether it is Lukashenko or it is the elected leader of the Belarusian society, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, or anyone else, basically he or she will have to deal with the Russian factor. At the same time, Russia has stakes in all economy sectors of Belarus, as mentioned, starting from banking sector and ending up with logistics. And the only sector which basically remained independent from Russia is IT sector. Now, indeed, it is a very, very complicated relation. But at the same time, this is a relation which is based on Russia's intention to maintain its control over the assets it does have in Belarus. Reminder: there is no border regime between Belarus and Russia. So effectively, Belarus is fulfilling also the role of the western border frontier of Russia, and the security dimension in this domain is very important for Russia. It's also the Common Security Treaty Organization that Belarus and Russia are the members of, is somewhat an attempt of Russia to create anti-NATO bloc. So indeed, it's impossible to ignore Russia. But at the same time, what we see from the reaction of Kremlin vis-a-vis developments in Belarus is somewhat different from what one would expect. We know often that Kremlin speaks not only through the lips of Mr. Peskov, who is a spokesman of Putin, but also through the lips of Russian state propaganda, Russian TV is in particular. And we see that there is no single narrative, there is no unified narrative that Russian propaganda TV is broadcasting when comments on Belarus. We see there is a certain permission provided by Kremlin to Russian propagandists to develop their own story. We see a certain difference in the way how they present the state of affairs. Although it has been noted that the head of Russian Secret Service (FSB), Mr. Patrushev, has been a frequent guest to Lukashenko. It's been also confirmed by Lukashenko himself that the Russian propaganda channel Russia Today specialists are working for Belarus Propaganda TV, because there were over 100 technical staff of Belarusian state media who have just left their jobs in the sign of protest against regime, something one would not expect before, because it was considered as a backbone of the regime. So I imagine that for Russia, it is an existential question to maintain Belarus in its closest orbit. And at the same time, we see that among Belarusians, there is no anti-Russian mood. There is no anti-Russian, let's say, intention to carry on with. Many Belarusians, in fact, benefit from these close economic ties and visa-free regime with Russia. At the same time, it is a commonly accepted fact that if Russia starts to fulfill any, let's say, force-driven scenario against Belarus, either we talk about troops on ground or anything else, clearly this would be perceived by Belarusian society in a very unanimous mode. And I don't think that Kremlin wants to have 9.5 Belarusians standing against Kremlin. It's better for them to have Belarusians Russia-friendly. At the same time, if you ask a common Belarusian who he or she would like, how would they portray an ideal Belarus? My guess is they would say Switzerland. They would like to see Belarus with everyone and with no one at the same time, to benefit from the both frontiers, because, you know, Belarus shares almost 1,500 kilometers of border with Russia. At the same time, it does share 1,100 kilometers of border with the European Union and NATO. So therefore, trying to counterbalance between these two, I think, is an ideal scenario what Belarusians would love to see their country evolving. So this is definitely not the Maidan of Kiev of 2013, 2014, or it's not the Rose Revolution of Georgia. But at the same time, it is clear that the Russian factor is very important in all this development. And we see that Russia tries to meddle already now into transition period by popping up some bizarre political parties that may take place in a future parliamentarily arrangement of the upcoming Belarus with potentially new constitution. But yet at the same time, people are demonstrate quite visible resilience against any attempts of external influence towards their domestic affairs.
Well, look, it looks like we're basically out of time. So I want to thank both of you for really interesting analysis, and take Victor as well. We might get back and do it again. I do want to first of all, I want to thank Brian Mateo for playing from BARD, for playing an important role in organizing this, as well as our panelists. And I do want to let people know, if you go to opensocietyuniversitynetwork.org, there's a really interesting talk this Thursday at noon US time. Note there's an hour time difference between US and Europe than there was last week, on the US election. So those of you interested in learning what the potential outcomes of the US election are, this Thursday at noon, there will be another broadcast for the Open Society University Network. And again, thank you to our audience and to our panelists. And this is really, really insightful. And it's great to hear from friends within the network about what is taking place, what is similar, and very much what is different between what's going on in Belarus and Kyrgyzstan. So thank you, and thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, for moderating and arranging all this discussion.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.